Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. David Head and Dr. Timothy Hemmis, the co-editors of A Republic of Scoundrels, the schemers, intriguers, and adventurers who created a new American nation. Dr. Head has been on this show once before when we discussed his book on George Washington, which was called The Crisis of Peace. And Dr. Hemmis is writing a book on merchants in early America. Both have written and taught widely. Doctors Head and Hemmis, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having us. We're delighted to be here and to get to talk to you about the book. You know, that title never gets old, right? A Republic of Scoundrels. I think that was Tim's idea.
Yep.
But yeah, I love the way that sounds.
Thanks for being here also, Dr. Hemmis, for the first time.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start the interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. The Founding Fathers, the path-breaking generation that fought with dignity, wrote with moral clarity, and bound the colonies together with one goal in mind, right? Well, except that's not what happened at all. Doctors Head and Hemmis argue that mixed in with those like Washington, Jefferson, and Hamilton who were fighting for a new nation, those who have been given those glowing reputations by later historians, mixed in with them are a batch of anti-founders, those who worked to stop the founding from succeeding at all. So doctors, I'm not sure who wants to take it. It's a lot of fun to have two of you on at once, right? It's 2-on-1 now. Doctors, how did you realize that their stories, the stories of the scoundrels, are just as important as those who we revere today?
We have looked at the Founding Fathers as kind of the American saints. In reality, the founding was really a founding generation. And like there's today, there's a whole array of different folks that are contributing. And in that founding era, there's all sorts of folks. And with the American Revolution, it kind of opens up a Pandora's box and of ethics, morality, all these different things, politically, commercially. And these founding fathers are pushing boundaries to, in order to have boundaries, you got to push them, right? And so they're trying to figure out what can they do and get away with it, right?
Dr. Head, how did you realize that their stories, the stories of the scoundrels, are just as important as Dr. Hemmis put it, the saints?
Yeah, so I think one thing that you can reflect on just for a minute that makes a lot of sense, and you'll realize you have misconceptions. So a lot of people think the founders are this discrete group of 6 guys or something, or maybe the guys who signed the Constitution is 55. If you think about a second, well, of course, it can't just be 6 guys who do everything, right? There are lots of different people, and the population of the United States is in the millions already in the early republic at the founding. So it takes a lot of people, and of course, then you start thinking about this. Well, there are people of all different backgrounds, just as there are today. So we have the main guys that we zero in on, but they of course weren't working in a vacuum. And one of the things that you see in the research, if you study this period, you see some of the same names come up again and again that aren't the most famous names like Jefferson and Washington and all those, but the guys that Jefferson and Washington are dealing with on a regular basis. And sometimes they're mentioned in these sort of shady circumstances. A good example of this is one of the chapters is about James Wilkinson. So James Wilkinson was a general in the United States Army. He's a general in his early 20s during the American Revolution. And eventually in the early republic becomes the highest ranking general in the army at the time, the most senior officer. And he's also a paid agent of the Spanish government, like passing them information. And he seems to be involved in every kind of scheme or plot or really anything happening in the western part of the country, which at this point is like Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky, Louisiana. That's the West, late 18th, early 19th century. So how do you have this figure who is both the sort of notorious in a kind of rumor mongering sort of way as somebody who's out for himself, not necessarily acting in the best interest of the country, So there's lots of whispers about him, and yet he gets these high commands all the time. He's a trusted leader on the frontier. So a guy like Wilkinson, what do you do with him? Where does he fit in this story of the America's founding? But he's not the best remembered, but he was certainly influential at the time. So where exactly does he fit? And that's kind of where the story of the scoundrels, the puzzle really of the scoundrels comes in, right? How do you fit all these guys into the story that we know so well?
And so when you both started studying history, I'm always so curious about like this sort of high school senior, college freshman viewpoint that some kids have, including myself, that the founding generation was always sort of, even if there were flaws, they were always bending towards justice, that they had this like sixth sense of freedom, and how to articulate freedom and how to bring freedom to millions of people. Did you have the same sort of sense that these were generally good guys and that there wasn't a lot of dissension in them, or did you early ingrained in your studies on your way to becoming PhDs, did you sort of understand that there were going to be these people who were always working against them? What was your evolution like in those terms?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've always been drawn to kind of, I guess, scoundrel-like figures. My
You're not
PhD.
one though, I promise.
No,
You're
no,
not
right. I should, yeah, right. So my research in historical writing, I've been drawn to, right. So my PhD research, my first book was where it was about pirates. This is something I've continued to do a little bit of in my career. So I really like pirates, for example. Scoundrels, right, are kind of fit a natural fit, and there are people who are lawbreakers and all that kind of thing. Just appeal to me for some reason. Thinking back, that's a great question, right? What can I remember being taught or knowing about the founders coming out of high school and early in college? And I don't remember being taught a whole lot explicitly about the founders. I graduated high school in the late '90s. So even then, there was a kind of dearth of focus on the founders. We talk about like the history content and all that. Today we fight over this as if its disappearance is a new thing. I mean, this is 25 years ago. So I guess what I was left with really was just the general things from the culture. I remember Joseph Ellis's book, Founding Brothers, right, was a big deal.
That was an early
a
formative book for me too. Yeah.
Yeah. And the idea of this kind of brothers, it's also around the same time as the Band of Brothers, right? World War II book and movie, TV series. So yeah, that kind of idea of right, brothers, they fight somewhere, but they're all together, ultimately pushing for the same thing. That's definitely the message that I would have picked up in high school and in college.
Dr. Hemmis, what about you?
So I know early on, I'll be honest, I was not interested much in the early Republic. I was like early on in high school, I was interested in World War II, the Civil War, like the big wars, right? So I am still a military historian. But what's interesting is as I got into college, I started pushing back further and further. And that's how I got into the early American history. But one of the things I write the chapter on Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr is just a blip in public schools, even in college, like the survey courses. He may get a day, and maybe even just a mention.
And that got milk commercial served him. That was the main thing people knew about him, right?
And that was, that was Michael Bay that directed that?
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
it's a brilliant ad. I mean,
it is
unforgettable.
David and I were talking about that when I was working on the chapter, and I was like, I had to look it up and figure out, because I was like, I have to get the Got Milk commercial into the book. And because everybody knows Hamilton, right? Hamilton explodes the founding fathers. Like that musical just kind of is a whole paradigm shift in a way for the field.
We've heard several times on this show that the original colonies did not see themselves as one cohesive force beyond this common defense idea. How much did their sort of, the idea that they were different nations, how much did that idea contribute to the potential to have schemers among them who were willing to bust up the whole thing?
Right. That's one of the things that Right. That's the potential that's there. Okay, so they fight the revolution together and then hang together loosely, especially in the 1780s, right? It's not at all clear that they're going to become one nation that sticks together for a very long time. And a lot of the foreign powers know this and are eager to exploit it. So the Spanish minister, for example, to the United States, we have a chapter about him that Tyson Reeder, a professor at BYU, wrote. And he's Don Diego Gardaki is the Spanish minister's name, and he was helping the Americans during the Revolution to defeat their common enemy Britain. But afterwards, he's out for any scheme that can break the United States apart. He doesn't want a strong United States nation on the borders with Spain's empire in North America. So that's certainly one thing that leaves the new United States very vulnerable, especially in the 1780s, in the period after the war but before the Constitution. I mean, that's like, okay, we foreign powers are sensing weakness and they're eager to exploit it.
Dr. Hemmis?
Yeah, I mean, David's correct that there's the frontier or the borderlands is so multinational, and
you have France, you have Spain, Britain, they're all involved.
France is not there as much, but I mean, Spain and Britain are the two big ones that are really pushing to disrupt anything on the American frontier. And there's plenty of Americans who are looking at the Articles of Confederation and are saying, oh, this is a mess. And we need to find some way to find economic stability for ourselves. And so they go into business with Spain, or some still join with the British. But I'm thinking of George Morgan, who is in the book, but we don't really touch on his New Madrid schemes. That's is why Aaron Burr shows up at his house and tries to recruit him and his family to join him in his own schemes. But it's because of that transitional period that allows these men to seek out other opportunities, right? And the frontier is that zone that allows where there's no kind of oversight, really.
Yeah, and you also have states like against states, or like inside of the state, one part of the state against another part of the state.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe people have seen those kind of early funky maps where like Virginia's territory extends like all the way to the Mississippi.
Yeah, it's like all the way to Ohio. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's what like the early states claim. They claim like Virginia claims like way out west, and who even knows where it ends. But some of the people living in the western part of the state, they don't want to be governed by the eastern part of the state. They want to break off and form their own. And that's where Kentucky and Tennessee are two great examples of states that broke away from one of the original 13 states. So there's that kind of rivalry. People who want to stay within the United States as a nation, but to be their own separate state as well. We could have other ones like this. There's a place called Franklin that tried to become its own state out there in the West. So that doesn't succeed. But yes, the one part of the state, western parts of the state versus the eastern part of the state, the United States versus Spain, England, it's all kind of up for grabs.
Dr. Hemmis?
And you also have to look at there's a kind of an east-west regionalism. We often think about sectionalism in the United States as north and south. But really before the election of 1800, for an arbitrary time, it's really east and west. And that's how you get the Whiskey Rebellion and all these different, like the West has a different culture. Now, we don't really get too far into that in the book. We had more ideas to expand the book, but for publication's sake, it's
hard enough.
We had to trim it down.
Yeah, and before we get to more of the sort of narrative of this book and the different stories that you have, I'm just curious to ask what made this particular topic good for an edited book of essays that you farmed out, as opposed to a book that you would say co-write yourselves?
Yeah, so that's one of the things we discussed. I think the deciding factor is we had so many characters to become expert enough in all of them, in all of the literature, and especially all of the sources, when some of these characters are doing illegal things that are hard to uncover, right? That would have just been a monumental task. It would have taken us 15 years to do that, not 3 that we ended up doing. So we thought it would be a better choice to recruit people who are already experts in people like Benedict Arnold and James Wilkinson and some characters we honestly we never heard of before we started doing this, like Philip Nolan, who's a horse trader in Texas. The person who ended up writing our Benedict Arnold chapter, James Martin, he's been writing about Benedict Arnold for 40 years, right? So I mean, I'll be 85 before I could have that kind of expertise.
Yeah.
So far better to draw on people who had a deep engagement and expertise in those sources, so we can get the full picture of this kind of practice of scoundrelry in the early Republic.
And so, Dr. Hemmis, how do you pick the writers and assign the topics? How did that all work?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have to kind of organically start how this project evolved. Is I was doing research and kept coming across these names, and I had this idea that there was going to be this, a project that I wanted to write about these scoundrels of the American Republic or American frontier. And then the pandemic hit, and we were all in lockdown. And I threw this idea out on Twitter, and David and a couple other folks reached out and responded to me, and was talking about, this is a really cool project. And so that's how we got some of the contributors. Others, David and I just kind of put our heads together and tried to figure out who would be best to fit into these for these chapters.
Isn't History Twitter, just as an aside, I mean, isn't History Twitter completely amazing? The community that it's helped build. I mean, I saw two people in the Oval Office the other day who, I can't say I quite know them personally, but I guess I sort of do. And they're super famous authors at this point. And there I am congratulating them like one-on-one, like, hey, you were in the Oval Office with Joe Biden. How did History Twitter do this, do you think?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
No. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Yeah, that really is a great point. I've met Tim mostly through Twitter. Yeah. And lots of people who I never would have come across otherwise. It was well suited to the pandemic when you couldn't meet people in person. Mm-hmm. But honestly, it's better for networking. I found it's better for networking than the traditional way of going to conferences and all that kind of thing. Especially if you're like me, kind of shy and introverted, right? Meeting lots of people at a conference is overwhelming. Mm-hmm. When you could pick and choose who you engage with through the computer, that's a lot more manageable. So yeah, it really has been a wonderful community. Yeah. It's really, sometimes people say, well, how, this has ruined the profession, right? There's too much trolling and sniping at each other. But it was always like that. It's just kind of made it public the way some of those conversations.
Like all professions.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of brought it out in the public, aired our dirty laundry.
Yeah. Dr. Hemmis, what about for you?
I mean, I think the same way as, I joined, and Twitter was one of those things where I wasn't quite sure what I was doing on it at first. And then it was that networking aspect that really kind of connected. And it's quite funny how many people I've met. I've gone to a conference and be like, I know you. And then I only know you because of Twitter.
In my late 20s and early 20s, I got into the habit of writing emails to authors, right? Like I'd say, what a great book you wrote. Wow. Like that was so cool. Thanks so much for writing it. And now like we're following each other and I'm messaging them and I'm like, how did this all happen? One of them, I won't say who, but one of the people in the Oval Office the other day sent books to my daughter when she was born. Wow. I mean, how did this happen?
Yeah. So did people write back to you when you wrote emails to them? Did they respond? What was your response rate?
It's a good question. Most people did write back. Some very elaborate and thoughtful answers, which is really a thrill. Some would write back like, hey, thanks a bunch. Appreciate your reading, signed XYZ or whoever it is. And other people wouldn't respond. I think most people responded, and History Twitter kind of magnified all that. And most people are very willing to respond and write, and it's just super cool. All right. Anyway, back to the editing part of this. When you got an essay back, Dr. Hemmis, do you make suggestions as editors and go back to the authors, or is you just pretty much sign up to take it as it is? And then I guess is feedback ever not well received in the editing process?
Well, I mean, I think
No name. I'm not getting no names. I'm just curious in general.
We got a lot of really strong essays. So there was, I mean, of course, there's always going to be some kind of editing that goes involved. Occasionally we'll be like, who is this? Trying to figure out kind of more contextual stuff. But for the most part, it was, we got a lot of strong essays. So I don't, what do you say, David?
Yeah, I think it depended. I mean, a couple of them were like ready to go with just light proofreading. Others, needed more assistance in kind of guiding the author to what we were trying to do. It also helps in some of these that we were not experts in these characters, so that our perspective is closer to what a reader's perspective would be. So that when someone uses, kind of shorthand or something, we can point out and say, can you explain this quickly? I don't follow you here or something. Whereas if we really, really knew it, but well, we might just look, oh, of course, everybody knows that. So I think that's the kind of level that we did. We sort of never rejected anybody. That never happens, which I guess could happen. And everybody was pretty much was generally good sport and getting things back to us on time. I was really gratified that one of our contributors, he wrote back to us, said this is the best experience I've ever had with an edited collection. So yeah, that made us feel really good.
Well, when it comes to, look, you're both seasoned historians. You've both written and taught, as I said in the introduction, very widely. How much of a gift is it, even for you, people who are as seasoned as you are, to get an essay back and just say, wow, this is really, really good. I'm learning things here that I didn't know.
Oh yeah, that's one of these secrets of why we're doing this is it's a chance for us to learn, a field very closely. I mean, certainly, the time is so crunched, you don't have the time to read as widely as you would like to. Well, this forces you to read a lot wider than you normally would. I remember the chapter by Chris Magra, he's a historian at the University of Tennessee. He was writing about William Blount. And over again, I was just shocked that what the kind of brazen schemes that Blount was running to defraud veterans, to bully Native Americans out of their land. I kind of heard the name in passing. William Blount was one of the first senators from Tennessee, and he's also the first senator to be impeached. That's what he's famous for, infamous for. But yeah, there's a much deeper story to what was going on there. So that was great. I mean, yeah, I learned so much from that, and that'll stick with me. And that's definitely way to learn things.
Yeah, Dr. Hammond, what was it like for you to just get back an essay and go, this is a really good essay, and I'm really glad I got a chance to read this as an editor?
Oh yeah, there were some great ones. There was a couple times David and I would just text him back and be like, "Wow, didn't know about this," or "What do you think about that?" And so it was really kind of interesting, like the Philip Nolan essay. When I was reading it, I was like, "Wait a second." So it starts off talking about a monument. Well, I'm here in Texas, and there's a monument just north of me, about an hour and a half north of me. So I had to go find it. And so it's actually in the photo of it is in the insert. So
yeah, you would have, if you otherwise you would have just driven by there, how many times in your life and never grasped the significance of what this was all about. Right.
Mm-hmm.
One of the names that comes up in the book, and a name that has come up, it comes up every now and again. I think Trump always talks about Benedict Arnold, right? He's like Benedict Arnold. Explain what James Kirby Martin wrote about Benedict Arnold and how important it is that we understand the real story of who he was and what he tried to do.
Yeah, so Benedict Arnold, of course, this is probably the most commonly known name of the in the book.
Most commonly known name of the Scoundrels. The Scoundrels.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So Martin starts off by talking about how Arnold is infamous and will ever be known as like the devil of the revolution, right? He was the center point of this. What Martin really tries to argue is not that, Arnold didn't commit treason, or he had the best reasons, or it was his wife's fault or something. He points out that, Arnold was probably the worst scoundrel amid a bunch of scoundrels in the army at that time. He certainly went further than anybody else, but there were plenty of other generals who were squabbling over rank and credit, and who were stealing Arnold's laurels, right? He was one of the best battlefield commanders the Americans had, and he never got the credit because other guys were more effective at the politics of it behind the scenes. So that's really where you get. So the purpose of the book as a whole, I think I'm really proud of, is it's not to like turn up our understanding of the founders upside down and say they were really bad guys or we used to think they were good. It fleshes out the larger context. Yes, Arnold was a bad guy, but here are these other guys who were around at the same time. And he was the worst, but there are the others who were scoundrels also, kind of pushing him and prodding him. And eventually he succumbed to a temptation that others were right there with him too.
Dr. Hemmis, how can the story of Benedict Arnold inform us today as we watch this era in politics where almost everybody is accused of being a traitor?
Well, I think we have to remember that, this is history and there are lessons to be learned, but our main purpose of the book was not to spotlight on any connection to the present, but really to tell the story of the past. And I think the comforting thing is, as a country we can think about, is those lessons that are from the past can influence decision making today. And I think there's probably Benedict Arnold's not the perfect choice, like one that you want to really focus in on that. I think Aaron Burr or even James Wilkinson, like the country still exists with all the turmoil, right?
So explain the Burr conspiracy. To me is so fascinating in a lot of ways because people today have no clue what it is. And I think even people who have studied it have a hard time putting together exactly what went wrong. So explain the Burr conspiracy is, or I guess explaining exactly what Aaron Burr and his cohorts did, but explain what the Burr conspiracy is.
So Aaron Burr, after the dueling with Hamilton and the murder of Hamilton, Burr goes out on a Western tour, as it's been told. And he goes out to the West and he's starting to look and play off this idea of regionalism, this East-West regionalism. And it's unclear, and this is where why it probably is very confusing, is because everybody Burr talks to, he tells a different scheme to. Whether he goes to George Morgan and is basically telling him, hey, I can raise an army of frontiersmen and take over Washington. Or, he tells someone else that he's going to go to New Orleans and seize New Orleans and then carve out territory in the West or filibuster in Mexico. I mean, all these different things, even like either it's really super genius, which I think it probably is, to cover, it's giving him plausible deniability if he's ever caught, which he is caught, allows him some wiggle room. And I think Burr he is a populist and he's trying to lift up himself in whatever situation. And we see this with several of our scoundrels, that they're really out for themselves, right? Mm. And Burr is definitely, he's been disgraced. He wants to recapture some of that glory because he's from that old stock, Jonathan Edwards relations. So I think he's trying to recapture his glory out on the frontier and is essentially an insurrection, or attempting a conspiracy of insurrection, if you will.
So Dr. Head, how did Aaron Burr go from telling these stories, these half-true fibs to all these people around the Southwest, to getting to bordering on insurrection?
Yeah, that's a great, that's how did that happen? That's also kind of a black box. It seems that some of the people he was talking to, trying to recruit, they either blew the whistle on him, right? So George Morgan writes a letter to Jefferson saying, "I just had dinner with this guy, and he's saying really alarming things, and you probably should look after him." Or James Wilkinson actually has some kind of plan going on with Burr, and Wilkinson then writes a letter and reports in on him. Burr would claim that guys like Wilkinson threw the blame on him to divert attention to their own misdeeds. So which version of that exactly is not entirely clear. So either they were, blowing the whistle when they found out that he was up to something no good, or they turned on him, right? An associate, and they blamed him before he could blame them for it. But it's never, entirely clear what exactly the circumstances were. I wouldn't put it past a guy like Wilkinson to do either of those things.
And what exactly was Aaron Burr trying to do? What was his goal here?
Well, right. Well, that's the thing we don't know. That's the thing that we don't know. I mean, was he serious about marching on Washington D.C. to take over the Capitol? That seems awfully extreme. Was he serious about marching an army into a Spanish-held territory in Texas? That seems more likely. I mean, people actually did that, like filibustering a private military adventure into Texas was something that guys kind of did in this period. Did he want to set himself up as emperor of his own country? No, maybe. So that's the problem. He was never entirely clear about what he did. And ultimately, this is what saves him. And this is really kind of sets a key precedent for the future, is that during his treason trial, the presiding judge, who just happens to be Chief Justice John Marshall, kind of splitting his time. At the time, Supreme Court justices did their usual Supreme Court justice appellate kind of thing, but then they also would sit as the trial judge in various different regions of the country, as if they didn't have enough work to do normally. And Marshall, delivers an opinion on the definition of treason. He says that treason, in order for a crime to be treason, it has to have an overt act. You have to make an overt act to strike against the government. Well, Burr never did anything overt. It was all kind of under the scenes, behind the scenes, under the radar, and never making an overt act against the United States government. So then when the jury hears that, well, if that's the definition of treason and Burr never did it, then he has to be acquitted. And that, I think, sets an important precedent because it makes treason really hard. It makes treason hard to convict for. If there had been a looser definition of treason, you could easily imagine that this would have been a fixture of our national politics, with every politician, accusing somebody else of treason, not just as a rhetorical device, but like as an actual crime that they could pursue.
Dr. Hemmis.
And you could guess how that would have gone.
Yeah.
There's a good argument that the prosecution didn't bring the correct charges. They brought treason charges because, well, Jefferson said it was treasonous and all sorts of different things, right? In reality, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to point that out. They probably should have brought conspiracy charges against, because there was enough evidence for that, because they stockpiled guns and all sorts of different things. Like there was evidence for conspiracy, but not an overt action of, overthrowing the government or anything. It was mostly
there's a however many pound elephant you want to suggest in the room right now. I'm just curious what similarities or differences you see with the effort by a sitting president to bring, electors for the Electoral College that were not necessarily authentic, and people went around the country trying to convince other people to sign up and say, hey, I'm a presidential elector. And then we saw what happened on January 6th. Can we draw lines between these two conspiracies?
I don't think you can draw lines. I think you can take lessons from them. And I think because everybody talks about history repeating itself or runs in cycles or whatever. And I don't think that, because, every day is not Groundhog's Day, right? Great movie, by the way. So I struggle with trying to make any connections to that. Like you can probably see, parallels and whatnot, but not direct lines.
Dr.
Um,
Head?
Yeah, I can say I think one of the things that is worrisome about you see there's the latest effort to exclude exclude former President Trump from the ballot in different states, right? And you can see if there's not a tight definition of what how you actually fit into that category to be removed from the ballot in a situation that is not the Civil War, right? When that part of the amendment was originally written, I worry that that could easily be weaponized, right? And that could be just part of politics in the future. That well, you don't like the other guy, well, you just don't let him be on the ballot. And that's what I was talking about with a looser definition of treason and how they could have just used that terminology, they just use that charge over and over and over again until it doesn't have any more meaning to it. I mean, this is something I also worry about with impeachment, right? I used to think of impeachment as something this rare. It only happened a couple of times, right? And then Clinton impeachment. I remember, again, being in high school, I guess I was in college at that point, thinking, well, this is like a world historical event of importance, right? And now you have multiple impeachments, and students are just kind of blasé about this now.
Yeah,
And
yeah, you can go back and look, and there were calls to impeach George W. Bush.
Mhm.
There were calls to impeach Barack Obama. Donald Trump was impeached. There were calls
Twice,
to
yeah,
impeach Joe twice, and Joe
right.
Biden was is being called on to be impeached as well right now.
Yeah, and it could be one of those things where, again, it just happens at, like every president gets impeached now.
yeah.
And is that going to be like, well, okay, it's my turn to get my impeachment, no big deal.
Yeah.
And then, like, what tool do we have after that? Right?
Yeah.
What's beyond impeachment?
Well, no president's
Nothing
been
good.
removed yet, right? So we'll
Yeah,
be curious to see if we get
nobody's been removed yet. I guess maybe that's what it'll be. Everybody gets their impeachment, and then it only gets serious if it looks like you might get 2/3 majority.
all right, I want to ask about one more essay and then start wrapping things up here. But so I want to ask about my buddy Craig Bruce Smith's essay. He's a Ranger fan like I am, so we chat about the Rangers, mostly some history, but mostly Rangers. I want to ask about the Devil from Diem. Diem, is that how you say it?
Dedham.
I think it's Dedham. But
Dedham.
maybe I
missed
don't have
a D.
I don't have a Massachusetts accent, so
I must have missed a D. The Devil from Dedham, Jason Fairbanks and the failure of manly virtue. Who is Jason Fairbanks, and what's manly virtue in this context?
Right. So Jason Fairbanks is the son of a prominent Massachusetts family, and he had the misfortune of being born too late to participate in the American Revolution, or any of the colonial wars. So that's actually something that happened for men of his generation or his cohort, right? They their fathers, their uncles, their grandfathers, their older brothers, even they got to have a war and prove their prove that they were men by being shot at, right? So throughout history, it's one of the primary ways that men prove their what they're made out of is engaging in combat, and he doesn't have that. So he grows up under the shadow of somehow being lesser than, simply because he was too young to go fight in the American Revolution. So he has to try. So he's trying to figure out some other way that he can prove his value, and he never really finds it. Unfortunately for him, he has a kind of disability, so he can't engage in any kind of sort of physical labor or anything like that to show he's stronger than other men. He wants to have an education. That might be another path to status, but he's not quite smart enough to get into the top schools, right? He becomes fixated on the daughter, a young lady in the community, and if he can marry into a high status family, well, that's another strategy, right? To gain his kind of the recognition of others that he is a man of a real worth. But of course, the girl doesn't like him and rejects his advances, and he most likely murders her. He comes back with this kind of story about how he didn't murder her. She stabbed herself because he was going to break off their engagement, and she was so distraught that she couldn't live anymore. Okay? So that he's then arrested and tried for murder. And there's a significant number of people who, for some reason, look at him and say, "Oh, the poor boy," right? He just wasn't loved enough by his family. And I could save poor Jason if he had met me first, kind of thing. So there's hostility towards him, but there's also a vein of sympathy that's really interesting. So that's what Craig was writing about. This one murder trial that becomes very famous in the New England region, but also its larger significance for what it tells us about these men who were born too young for the revolution, right? The most significant event of that era, and they couldn't participate, and they didn't know how to prove themselves valuable when so many other men around them, older than them, had done so.
Dr. Hemmis, what can we take away from this essay today?
I mean, I think when you're thinking about, like today we're bombarded with all these different kind of scandalous, love triangles and whatnot that get put into, was it Dateline or 48 Hours or whatever those types of things. Back then, that didn't happen a lot. And so this is bombshell news. And this has, in a lot of ways, is the trial of the century. And until Burr, really. And so people are fixated on this because they're like, ooh, this is something that's not out of the normal.
Were people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, were they aware of the scoundrels? How well did they identify who these people were who were fighting against the idea of a founding?
Oh yeah, they write letters to some of these guys. I mean, Wilkinson owes his appointment to the various presidents during his lifetime. So yes, they are very much aware of many of them. I believe even someone Philip Nolan, the horse trader who kind of scheming in Texas, I believe he came to the attention of Thomas Jefferson, and he had a relation who was going to set up a meeting, and then, for whatever reason, Nolan never followed through. He never went back east. He stayed in the Louisiana area. So yeah, these are guys who come to the attention of our famous founders. And the founders wouldn't have written so often about the need for public virtue if they weren't cognizant that so many men fell short of it. Right. So yes, they know there's the potential out there. They know there's a danger from these kind of characters, and they're trying to be on guard against it. And also guys like Burr, but Hamilton and many of these guys, they were all, like land speculation was kind of like the cryptocurrency of its day, right? This kind of thing that everybody gets into. It was a mad rush, was to buy up some of those Western lands. Of course, George Washington is the ultimate land baron, right? I mean, he never met a land deal that he didn't know how to analyze and get excited about. So yeah, they're definitely they're definitely cognizant of that world and the people in it, and worry about the threat that some of these scoundrels may pose to the country's future.
Dr. Hemmis, how do we spot a scoundrel today? What are the signs of a scoundrel?
Well, there's a lot there. I think I like to go back to, our definition. We kept trying to figure out how to define a scoundrel, right? And I made the allusion to, Han Solo and Star Wars, and scoundrel would definitely shoot first, right? But which is probably my favorite line in the whole book. Not gonna lie. But the Samuel Johnson's definition of a mean, rascal, a villain. But someone really, we've expanded that to be someone more self-interested, someone that is all about themselves, that puts themselves above, the greater good, right? And so I think that's where you'll see a scoundrel, and we probably have met many of these folks in our own lives. Does that make bad people though?
I think a scoundrel is someone who knows what the rules are and either doesn't care to follow them or wants to bend the rules to his own advantage. Okay? So not someone who just, doesn't even recognize that anybody else has an interest, but someone who's like saying, okay, this is what's allowed. Here's how much I can take.
Yeah.
Try and stop me.
How would America have been different without the scoundrels? If the founding fathers just did what they wanted without anyone pushing back on them, how would this country be different today?
So that's one of the really fascinating questions, because despite their scoundrelry, some of these guys were really instrumental in establishing the communities and states. So William Blount, for example, I mean, his chicanery is one of the things that gets the population of Tennessee, that region of Virginia growing enough that it can break away and become Tennessee. If he's not there, swindling and doing deals and all that kind of stuff, Tennessee doesn't grow as fast, and it doesn't become a state on the same schedule. And who knows what could have happened. A similar thing about Kentucky. James Wilkinson was one of the founding members of Frankfort, Kentucky, which is where the capital is. So these and a number of guys also are influential on actually carrying out a kind of diplomacy on the frontier, because American control over the frontier is very weak. It's far from Washington. There's some sense there's not a lot of other guys out there, and the scoundrels are kind of promoting the U.S. interests alongside their own interests. Mm-hmm. So the country really turns out much differently if the scoundrels are these kind of scoundrel figures. If the scoundrel figures aren't there. So I don't think it could be a case of, well, if we just removed them, everything would have been great. If we would have removed them, everything would have been different, and some things would have been better, but possibly other things would have been worse. And that's the really fun part to contemplate.
My big thought is if you removed them, if they didn't exist, someone else would fill that void.
They're always scoundrels.
Well, it's human nature. It's greed. It's all these different things that are driving people, right? And I think that's just a fact of human nature. And that's why we see these things happen across time, too.
So, of course, I wasn't there when you guys were having your heated discussions about this book and what the paths forward were. I'm just curious, not to say that you had those discussions, but that's what I'm imagining with two smart people are, discussing a book project. Do you know what you'll do next? Will you do another joint project next? Will you edit a book next, or will you go off and write your own at this point?
Yeah, I think we're both kind of considering our options. We certainly have enough guys or enough scoundrels to fill another book. You just keep looking, and it's not hard to find these characters in the early Republic. I know, Tim, you're working on a couple of other projects on your
tell
own.
us, I have a project. I'm working on the biography of a guy named Thomas Hutchins. Thomas Hutchins was the geographer of the United States. He dies in 1789, so it's like he's gone way too early in a lot of ways. But he was good friends with George Morgan, who appears in the book. So there's a lot of, I believe he really deserves some kind of a biography that's published. So,
Dr. Head, you know what you're going to do next?
No, I'm still weighing different options. It's I do take a lot of time to select projects. I think one of the things that I've been successful with is choosing the right project and really being patient with it, because I need something that is significant, something that's fun, but also for me, something that fits in with my other obligations of teaching and having 3 little kids and all that kind of thing.
Can't even fathom.
Yeah, certainly one of the things I like best about this editing project is that I could do it, right? I could fit it into the small amounts of time. I didn't need to travel to do research at an archive. I could do it after I've read my son his story about pandas. I can then go switch over to scoundrels and work in elaborate bamboo analogies or something. But yeah, so I try to be careful about selecting the right projects. So then they're doable, then I can, have a good experience with them.
Doctors David Head and Dr. Timothy Hemmis, the co-editors of A Republic of Scoundrels, the schemers, intriguers, and adventurers who created a new American nation. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Check out the book and also learn more about David at davidheadhistory.com. And check out Timothy on the website formerly known as Twitter at HemmisT. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.